The morning the Hargrove building came down, Maren Cole was standing 40 feet away with her coffee going cold and her heart doing something she hadn't let it do in years. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had a 9 o'clock at a client's Upper West Side condo fabric swatches and a leather portfolio under her arm, a cab already waiting at the corner of 58th and Lex. But then she'd seen the crane, then the hard hats, then the bright yellow demolition notices taped to the boarded-up windows of what used to be the most beautiful Art Deco building in Midtown Manhattan, and her feet had simply stopped cooperating. 47 stories of pale limestone and hand-carved ornamental stone. Black granite lobby floors she had walked across 100 times as a child holding her father's hand. The bronze elevator doors with their geometric sunburst pattern, all of it scheduled to be reduced to rubble and dust before noon. A man in a hard hat broke away from the crew and walked toward her. "Ma'am, you need to step back behind the barrier." "Who authorized this?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. The man blinked. "Excuse me, the demolition permit. Who signed off on it?" She wasn't asking. She was demanding. He scratched the back of his neck. "That'd be the developer, ma'am. Caldwell Group." Caldwell. Of course it was Caldwell. Maren Cole took one last look at the Hargrove building, at the ornamental keystones above the third-floor windows, at the weathered stone griffins flanking the entrance that she had drawn in her sketchbook when she was 9 years old, telling her father she wanted to make buildings like that someday. Beautiful buildings. Buildings that lasted. Then she turned around, got in the waiting cab, and started making calls. She'd been doing this long enough to know that preservation fights were mostly won or lost before they ever reached a courtroom or a zoning board. You had to build the case in the court of public opinion first. You had to make people care about a building the same way they'd care about a person, give it a history, a story, a face. Maren was very good at giving buildings faces. Her firm, Cole plus Ward, occupied the top floor of a brownstone on West 22nd Street in Chelsea. The sign on the door was simple, brushed brass letters on black. Inside was something else entirely. Maren had designed the space herself, and it looked like the inside of her mind, which meant it was organized chaos, beautiful and precise. Exposed brick walls hung with architectural drawings and material samples. A drafting table she still used by hand, even though half her staff drafted exclusively on screen. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with design history structural engineering manuals, a full run of Architectural Digest going back to 1972. In the far corner, a worn leather sofa she'd bought at a Brimfield flea market for $40 because she'd liked the bones of it. She dropped her portfolio on the drafting table and called her business partner. "Tell me you saw it," she said when Jonah Ward picked up. "I saw it. Landmark status application. How fast?" "Maren." A pause. "We've been through this. The Hargrove doesn't qualify under current city. Then we change current city criteria." She pulled up her browser and started typing. "Or we generate enough noise that the Caldwell Group decides the PR headache isn't worth it." Another pause. She could hear Jonah breathing that careful, measured breath he deployed when he was trying to decide whether to fight her or help her. "What's your angle?" he finally said. "Historical Commission first, then the Times real estate desk." She found what she was looking for, a 2019 architectural survey she'd co-authored that had flagged the Hargrove as a building of significant cultural merit. "And I want to call Delia Marsh at the Landmarks Conservancy. She owes me. She owes you a glass of wine at a holiday party. That's different from Jonah. That building has been standing since 1931. My grandfather walked past it on his way to work every day for 40 years. My father proposed to my mother in the lobby. It's not just architecture, it's—" "I know what it is," he said quietly. "I'll call Delia." She was already typing an email to the Times. The piece ran 4 days later. Maren had written it herself, an op-ed in the real estate section, sharp and precise and threaded through with personal history. She didn't plead, she didn't sentimentalize. She laid out the architectural significance of the Hargrove in clean, factual language, and then let the photographs do the emotional work. She'd spent 2 days pulling archive images, original construction photos from 1929, images from a 1954 Life magazine spread on Manhattan's Golden Age buildings, her own photography from a site visit she'd done 2 years prior. The response was immediate and louder than she'd expected. 200 comments in the first hour. A Twitter thread that went viral. 3 local news stations picked it up by evening. By the following morning, she had a call from a city council member's office and an email from the New York Landmarks Conservancy offering to formally partner on a preservation challenge. She also had a voicemail from a blocked number. She almost didn't listen to it. She got blocked number voicemails. Occasionally, usually journalists looking for quotes, sometimes architects she'd sparred with publicly over a project. But something made her play it. The voice was male, low and controlled, with the particular flatness of someone who had long since learned to keep their affect dialed down in professional contexts. Ms. Cole, my name is Declan Hargrove. I'm the CEO of the Caldwell Group. I read your piece in the Times. A beat. I'd like to meet. She played it again. Hargrove. The building bore his family name, or had until 4 days ago, when the marquee letters had come down along with the ornamental cornicing. She put the phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she called him back. If you're enjoying this story, you already know what it feels like to find something worth fighting for. This channel is full of stories about women who do exactly that, powerful, emotional, true-to-life dramas about love, ambition, and the courage to want more. Hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We put out new content every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The Caldwell Group occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower on 6th Avenue that Marin had always privately thought was the architectural equivalent of a man who owned no books. Efficient, expensive, completely without character. She arrived at 10 on a Tuesday morning wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt. Dark trousers, her hair pulled back in the kind of knot that said she wasn't here to be charming. She carried her portfolio under one arm and a folder of documents under the other. She had done her homework 3 nights of it. She knew the Hargrove site's zoning history going back to 1958. She knew the terms of the demolition permit. She knew the assessed value of the site, the projected revenue on the planned luxury condo tower, the name of the architect Caldwell had hired to design it. She also knew, because she'd spent an evening reading everything publicly available about Declan Hargrove, that he had joined the Caldwell Group 8 years ago as CFO, taken over as CEO 4 years later, and had since tripled the company's revenue and doubled its portfolio. That he had a reputation for being brilliant and difficult, and for not taking meetings he didn't expect to win. The receptionist walked her to a conference room on the 47th floor with a view that looked out over the entire west side of Manhattan. She was examining the view when the door opened. Declan Hargrove was not what she'd built in her head. She'd expected the archetypal Manhattan developer, stocky, blunt-featured, permanently tanned from ski weekends, the kind of man who wore his watch like a declaration of war. What walked through the door was leaner than that, and quieter than that. Dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, a charcoal suit that fit him in a way that suggested it had been made for his specific body rather than selected off a rack. Sharp jaw, eyes that were some complicated color between gray and green that she registered and then made herself not register. He extended his hand. "Ms. Cole, Mr. Hargrove." She shook it. His grip was firm without being performative. He didn't offer coffee. He sat down at the head of the conference table, and she took the chair to his left, not at the far end where a subordinate might sit, but close enough to be direct. He noticed. She saw the slight adjustment in his expression, not displeasure exactly, more like recalibration. "You wrote a very effective piece," he said. "I wrote an accurate piece. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He folded his hands on the table. "And you've generated considerable noise. The building deserves it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not apologetic, something more like genuine attention, the kind of look that meant he was actually listening, which was rarer in a room like this than it should have been. "The Hargrove building," he said, "has been in my family's possession since 1931. My great-grandfather built it. I spent every summer of my childhood in that building. My mother's design studio was on the 9th floor for 30 years. Marin said nothing. She waited. "The demolition is proceeding," he said. "That decision was made before your article, and your article doesn't change the structural calculus." "What structural calculus?" "The building has a failing HVAC spine. Full replacement would cost more than the assessed value of the structure. The foundation shows stress fractures consistent with a 2009 water main failure on the same block. Full remediation has never been formally assessed," she said, "because no structural engineer has conducted a full assessment in the past decade. The last survey was done in 2015, and I've read it. It flagged concerns. It did not recommend demolition. It recommended monitoring. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, a slight tightening around the eyes. You read the 2015 survey. I read everything I can find on a building before I advocate for it. Another pause. He was looking at her in that careful, direct way again. Why? Why did I read the survey? Why this building? You're a designer, an interior designer specifically. You don't have a financial stake in this property. You're not a preservation attorney. You're not a structural engineer. So why this building and why now? She held his gaze. Because it's beautiful and it matters, and someone has to say so. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's not a professional argument. I have professional arguments too. I just led with the real one. The silence stretched out between them. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people who are used to being the smartest person in the room realize they might have met a match. What are you proposing? He said finally. An independent structural assessment, full scope agreed upon by both parties. If the findings support demolition, I withdraw the preservation challenge and make a public statement acknowledging the structural necessity. And if they don't, then you halt demolition and we talk about adaptive reuse options. He looked at her for another long moment. You're not going to win this, Ms. Cole. That's a funny thing for someone to say when they're agreeing to a meeting. For the first time, just barely, something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. 3 weeks, he said. I'll hold the demolition crew for 3 weeks while the assessment is conducted. Both parties select one engineer. Both engineers agree on a third independent assessor. Agreed. He stood. She stood. They shook hands again. His hand was warm and his grip was the same as before, direct without theater. She was in the elevator before she let herself exhale. The structural assessment took 11 days. During those 11 days, Maren Cole and Declan Hargrove spoke 6 times. Twice by email. Once by phone, a 15-minute call about the scope of the assessment that had turned somehow into a 40-minute conversation about architectural materials in pre-war Manhattan construction. Once in person, when both had shown up at the building on the same morning to photograph the ornamental stonework on the west face before the scaffolding made it inaccessible for reasons he didn't specify. They'd stood on the sidewalk in the November cold for 20 minutes, discussing the geometric pattern in the Hargroves' lobby floor, which was an original terrazzo installation designed by an Italian craftsman whose name had been, until Maren dug it up, entirely lost to history. His name was Aldo Fabbri. He had immigrated to New York in 1924 and worked on 4 buildings in Midtown before dying of pneumonia in 1936 at the age of 41. His daughter, a woman named Carla Fabbri DiMaggio, was 93 years old and living in a care facility in Astoria. You found his daughter, Declan said. It wasn't a question. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she still couldn't entirely categorize. Someone should know the floor she walks on has a name attached to it. He was quiet for a moment. She looked up and found him watching her with something that had shifted almost imperceptibly from the boardroom attention of their first meeting. I had one of my researchers find her too, he said. Maren blinked. After you mentioned the name, I wanted to know. He paused. She made the trip last year, apparently, came to see the building, stood in the lobby. Maren felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. Did she know it was going to be demolished? I don't know. They stood on the sidewalk for another moment, both of them looking up at the west face of the building in the thin November light. My great-grandfather named it after himself, Declan said, which was standard for the era. A statement of permanence. He paused. He died in 1978. He never saw it torn down. Don't let it be torn down, she said simply. He looked at her. She looked at him. The construction noise from the neighboring block filled the silence between them. The assessment comes back in 5 days, he said. It came back in 4. She was at her drafting table on a Thursday afternoon when Jonah put his head in the door with an expression she couldn't read. You need to see this. The report was 47 pages. She read it standing up, turning pages fast, her finger tracking the technical language. The HVAC spine deteriorated but not failing. Replacement feasible. The foundation stress fractures more limited in scope than the 2015 survey had suggested. The 2015 survey had been conducted by an engineer without full access to the basement level. Structural integrity overall sound with targeted remediation. The building could be saved. She put the report down on her drafting table and sat very still for a moment. Then she called Declan Hargrove. He picked up on the second ring. I've read it, he said before she could speak. And a pause. She heard him exhale slow and controlled. Come to my office. Tomorrow morning. She arrived at 9. He was at his desk rather than the conference room. This time a large spare desk with 3 monitors and one of the neatest surfaces she had ever seen on a working desk, which told her something. He was the kind of person who thought clearly and hated clutter. He stood when she walked in, which she registered as a small but deliberate thing, and gestured to the chairs across the desk. She took one. He stayed standing for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city. Then he sat. The assessment is conclusive, she said. I know. So you'll halt demolition. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. I already called the crew. Something in her chest eased. She hadn't realized until that moment how tightly she'd been holding herself against the alternative. What's your vision for it? He said. The question was direct, practical, the voice of someone who had already made a decision and was moving to the next problem. Adaptive reuse. The floor plates are generous enough for residential conversion on the upper floors, commercial on the lower 3. The lobby and ground floor are historic in their own right. They should be preserved and activated. Retail or cultural programming, not just a pass-through. You've been thinking about this since the day I saw the demolition notice. He studied her. You want to design it, not a question. But she answered it anyway. Yes. The silence between them was different now than it had been in the first meeting. Less adversarial. The air in the room had shifted in some way she could feel but not precisely describe. The Caldwell Group has never done adaptive reuse, he said. I know. It's more complicated than new construction. Cost structures are unpredictable. I know that too. I've done 3 adaptive reuse projects in the last 6 years. I can show you the pro formas. I've already looked at them. He held her gaze. You're good. I'm very good, she said, no apology in it. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite the ghost of a smile from their first meeting. This one was fuller, brief, and controlled but real. All right, he said. I'll have contracts drafted. She was in the elevator again before she realized her hands were shaking. Not from nerves. From something else entirely that she wasn't ready to name. Working with Declan Hargrove was nothing like working with any client she'd had before. Most clients fell into patterns she'd learned to recognize over 12 years of practice. There were the avoiders, people who hired her and then disappeared, who wanted to be delighted by a finished product without participating in the process. There were the micromanagers who called 3 times a day and second-guessed every material selection. There were the enthusiastic amateurs who came to every meeting with magazine spreads and Pinterest boards and an unshakable belief that their vision was coherent even when it wasn't. Declan was none of these. He showed up to every meeting prepared, having read whatever she'd sent him in advance. He asked precise questions. He pushed back when he disagreed, which was often, but he pushed back with reasoning rather than instinct. He listened when she countered. He changed his position when she was right. He made her change hers twice. She did not enjoy working with clients who made her change her position. She found unexpectedly that she didn't mind it with him. The project had been officially designated the Hargrove Preservation and Adaptive Reuse Initiative. Cole Plus Ward was the lead design firm. Caldwell Group was the developer. They had a project timeline of 18 months and a budget that was substantial by any measure except the standard set by the building's ambition, which was Marin had discovered considerable. The more she dug into the building's original design, the more she found. The lobby floor was just the beginning. On the 6th floor behind a dropped ceiling installed in 1978, she and her team discovered the original coffered plasterwork ceiling intact, perfectly preserved, dusty and dark, but structurally sound. On the 9th floor, her father's floor, Declan's mother's floor. The original wood-paneled walls were still there behind the drywall. Cherry, she thought, though she'd have to bring in a specialist to confirm. In the basement mechanical room behind decades of accumulated infrastructure, the original ironwork structural details were still visible. She called him directly when they found the ceiling. She was standing on a scaffold in the 6th floor space at 7 in the evening, her crew gone for the day, her phone pressed to her ear, and she was aware that her voice had taken on a quality it usually reserved for conversations with Jonah or her sister, something unguarded and genuinely excited. "You need to come see this," she said. "Before my crew touches anything. I want you to see it the way we found it." A pause. Now, if you can, he could. He was there in 40 minutes, still in his work clothes. He worked late, she'd learned. He almost always did. She handed him a hard hat in the lobby and led him up the stairs because the elevators were decommissioned pending inspection, and by the time they reached the 6th floor, she was aware of how strange and private the building felt at this hour. Empty dark except for their work lights, full of the particular silence of a building that has been holding its breath for a long time. She aimed a work light upward and let him look. He was quiet for a long moment. The coffered plasterwork caught the light, and threw precise geometric shadows across the space, the same vocabulary as the lobby floor, she realized looking at it properly for the first time. Fabri hadn't just designed the floor. He'd designed both. The terrazzo and the plasterwork were in conversation with each other, top and bottom of the same room, the same mind. Fabri, Declan said before she said it. He'd reached the same conclusion at the same moment, the same geometric pattern, she confirmed. He was still looking up. In the harsh angle of the work light, his face was all planes and shadow, and she had the involuntary thought that he was beautiful, in the same way the building was beautiful, structured and a little austere, and more layered than the surface suggested. She looked away from him, looked at the ceiling. "We can restore it," she said. "There are specialists who do this work. It'll take time, and it won't be cheap, but it's possible." "Do it," he said, just like that. No cost-benefit analysis, no hesitation. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and something passed between them that she didn't analyze. Not then. "Okay," she said. They stood in the half-dark for another moment. Then she started talking about restoration methodology, and he started asking questions, and the building held its breath around them, and the night went on. December came. The project moved forward with the particular momentum that a well-matched team generates when it's firing on all cylinders. Marin's crew was excavating and documenting. The structural remediation was underway, the HVAC replacement proceeding on schedule, the foundation work more straightforward than the 2015 survey had feared. She had hired a plaster restoration specialist from Florence, who had done work at the Metropolitan Museum, and a terrazzo restoration firm from Philadelphia that was the best in the country. She had also, without entirely meaning to, started spending time with Declan Hargrove outside of project meetings. It happened gradually, the way these things do. A working dinner after a late meeting, they were both hungry. It was 9 o'clock, neither had eaten. A walk back from a site visit because the weather was unexpectedly mild and neither had reached for their phone to call a cab. A Saturday morning when she'd gone to the building to check on the basement work and found him already there sitting on a folding chair in the lobby, reading on his phone, and neither of them had pretended to be surprised. They talked about this project constantly, but they talked about other things too. He had a dry, quiet humor that she hadn't expected and that consistently caught her off guard. He read architecture, not the professional literature she expected from someone whose business involved buildings, but the history and theory of it. He knew who Fabri was before she'd told him. He'd known for years. "You knew," she said. They were at a diner on West 46th Street. Somehow, they'd ended up at a diner at 11 at night after a 3-hour meeting ran long, and she was looking at him across a booth with her coffee going cold because she kept forgetting to drink it. "My mother told me. She spent 30 years in that building, and she knew every inch of it." He paused. "She died 4 years ago. She never knew I was planning to demolish it." The silence that followed was different from any silence they'd had before. More personal. More freighted. "I'm sorry," she said. "She would have agreed with your article," he said. "She would have liked you." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, not evasively, just in the careful way of someone choosing their words. "Why did you call me?" she said. "After the article. You could have ignored me. You had the permit." He looked up. "I read your 2019 architectural survey, the one you co-authored. You understand buildings the way most people understand people." He paused. "I wanted to know what you would do with it." And she held his gaze. "I still want to know," he said. Something in his voice was quieter than usual, more unguarded. She looked at him for a moment longer than she should have. "You'll see it when it's done," she said. She told Jonah none of this. Or she told him the relevant professional details. The project was going well, the client was engaged, the timeline was holding, and pointedly omitted the rest. Jonah, who had known her for 11 years and designed this office with her, and watched her through a brief disaster of an engagement in her late 20s, and a longer, quieter grief after, was not fooled. "He's coming to the Thursday site meeting," she said one morning, not looking up from her drafting table. "He comes to all the site meetings," Jonah said. "He's coming to this one specifically because I told him about the cherry paneling on 9. A pause. And nothing. I'm telling you about the schedule. Marin? She looked up. Jonah was leaning in her doorway with his arms crossed and the expression he made when he was deciding whether to say a thing. It's a client relationship, she said. Okay. Don't okay me like that. I'm not doing anything. He pushed off the doorframe. I'll confirm Thursday. She looked back at her drafting table. The current drawing on the board was the sixth-floor restoration plan, the ceiling restored to Fabri's original specifications, in conversation with the floor below. She thought about Declan's face in the work light glow, the way he'd looked up at the ceiling with something that wasn't just professional calculation, something more like recognition. She made herself look at the drawing, only the drawing. January. The cherry paneling on the ninth floor turned out to be exactly that. American black cherry milled in 1929 in extraordinary condition under the drywall. The specialist she brought in stood in the space for a full 5 minutes without speaking before she said anything. I've never seen anything like this outside a museum, he finally said. Can we restore it? Miss Cole, it barely needs restoration. It needs cleaning, very careful cleaning, and a few targeted repairs. He ran his hand along the wood with an attention bordering on reverence. This is the work of someone who loved what they were doing. She stood in that room for a long time after he left. The afternoon light was coming through the west-facing windows that had been covered by interior walls since 1978, now re-exposed and falling on the cherry panels in a way that made the wood seem to glow from within. Golden red. Warm in a way the rest of the building, which ran to cool grays and pale stone, wasn't. She took photographs. She sent 3 of them to Declan without a message. He replied in 60 seconds a single line. My mother's studio was in this room. She sat down on the dusty floor and held her phone and felt the full weight of what they were doing here. Not just designing, not just preserving, but recovering something that had been lost. Giving it back. She typed, I know, I'll make it right. She stared at what she'd written. Then she sent it. His reply came 4 minutes later. I know you will. She put her phone in her pocket and sat in the cherry-paneled room in the afternoon light and let herself feel the things she'd been not feeling for 2 months. The thing that had started as professional respect and slow curiosity and had become somewhere in the process of late nights and diner booths and standing together in dark spaces with work lights, something considerably more complicated. She was not, she told herself, going to act on it. He was her client. The project was the thing. The building was the thing. She sat on the dusty floor for 10 more minutes. Then she got up, brushed off her trousers, and went back to work. The complication arrived in February, the way complications always do without warning, and wearing a friendly face. Her name was Sylvia Caldwell. No relation to the company. She had married into the name 20 years ago and kept it through the subsequent divorce, and she was one of Manhattan's most prominent real estate attorneys, the kind of person who operated at the intersection of money and power with such practiced ease that the seam was invisible. She and Marin had run in overlapping professional circles for years. They were not friends exactly, colleagues, occasionally useful to each other. Sylvia called her on a Tuesday morning in February and asked to meet for lunch. Marin said yes because she liked Sylvia and because she was curious about what specifically Sylvia wanted. What Sylvia wanted turned out to be a great deal more interesting than lunch. I have a client, Sylvia said over a corner table at a restaurant on West 55th Street, that was quiet and expensive and where people had conversations they didn't want overheard. A buyer. Very serious, very private. They're interested in the Hargrove project. The Hargrove project isn't for sale, Marin said. Caldwell Group owns the building. They're developing it themselves. My client is aware of that. Sylvia set down her fork with the precision of someone making a point. They're not interested in buying the building. They're interested in a partnership, a substantial one. She paused. They're prepared to offer $50 million in development capital in exchange for a 40% ownership stake. Marin was quiet for a moment. $50 million. That was not an ordinary offer. That was the kind of offer that changed the financial structure of a project entirely. Who's the client? Sylvia's expression shifted by a degree. I'm not in a position to disclose that at this stage. Then I'm not in a position to have this conversation. Sylvia looked at her. Marin, this is a very serious offer. I'm sure it is. Marin picked up her fork. But the Hargrove project has a developer. That developer hasn't asked me to broker development partnerships. And you're talking to me not to Caldwell Group. She looked at Sylvia directly. Why are you talking to me? A pause. Because my client believes that you have influence over the direction of the project. I'm the designer. I have design authority. That's different from development authority. My client is aware of the distinction. Sylvia was choosing her words now, carefully. They believe you might be in a position to advocate for this partnership, to present it to Declan Hargrove in a way that makes it attractive. Marin set down her own fork. She looked at Sylvia Caldwell across the white tablecloth and understood with a clarity that felt cold and precise exactly what she was being asked to do. I see, she said. It would be well worth your while, Sylvia said. My client is prepared to… What? No. Marin pushed back her chair and stood. No, Sylvia. I'm going to stop you there. Her voice was level. No heat in it, which was its own kind of cold. I don't use my client relationships to broker third-party deals. I don't leverage professional trust for personal gain, and I don't take whatever my client is prepared to is about to be. She picked up her bag. I'll pay for my own lunch. She walked out. She was halfway down 55th Street before she realized her hands were shaking again. Not the way they'd shaken after the first meeting with Declan, that trembling that was something close to hope. This was something different. Anger. And beneath the anger, something more unsettling. Because whoever Sylvia's mystery client was, they knew about her relationship with Declan. They'd identified it as a lever, which meant someone had been watching this project closely enough to see something that Marin herself had been carefully not naming. She stopped on the sidewalk and thought about that for a moment. About what it meant that someone from the outside watching had seen what she was still trying not to see from the inside. Then she called Declan. I need to tell you something, she said when he answered. In person, tonight if you can. He could. She met him at the building. It felt right. It was their space in a way that no boardroom or diner could be. The lobby was dark, but the work lights were on in the upper floors, and the building was full of the particular evening presence of a structure and process partway between what it had been and what it was becoming. She told him everything. Sylvia, the mystery client, the offer, what she'd been asked to do. He listened without interrupting. He was standing near the lobby entrance, his hands in his jacket pockets, his face doing the careful neutral thing he did when he was thinking hard. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You said no, he said. Of course I said no. I know you did. He looked at her. I'm not questioning it. He paused. I'm aware that there was something in it for you, and you said no anyway. There was nothing in it for me. Not anything I want. He looked at her steadily. Marin. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She felt it land in a specific way in her chest. I know who the client is, he said. She hadn't expected that. Who? Marcus Trent. He said the name with the flatness of someone who had a long and complicated history with a name. He's been after a stake in this property for 3 years. He tried to buy the building outright in 2021. I told him no. He paused. He apparently decided to try a different angle. He knew about… She stopped. About us. Declan said it without hesitation. Yes. Word travels. He held her gaze. I'm sorry he put you in that position. She looked at him. The lobby was dim, the work lights from upstairs throwing faint illumination down the stairwell. Around them the building was quiet, the particular quiet of late evening in a structure that had been full of human life for nearly a century and would be again. What is us? She said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out anyway. He was quiet for a moment. She was very aware of the distance between them, 4 feet maybe, the width of a corridor. I don't know how to answer that in a way that doesn't complicate the project, he said. I'm not asking about the project. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed those 4 feet and stood close enough that she could have reached out and put her hand on the lapel of his jacket if she'd wanted to. She didn't. She held very still. I've been telling myself it's professional interest, he said. His voice was low and careful. That I show up to things I don't need to be at because I'm engaged with the project. That I call you about things I could email about because it's more efficient. He paused. I'm not a good liar, certainly not to myself. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the full attention of that gray-green gaze, and nothing in his expression was calculated or managed, just honest. The project, she started, is separate, he said. Whatever this is, it doesn't have to be the same thing. In practice, those things get complicated. I know. He didn't look away. I'm asking if you want to try anyway. The lobby of the Hargrove building was quiet around them. The terrazzo floor Fabri's floor caught the light from above. Outside, the city went on being the city, relentless and enormous and indifferent to any individual moment of human decision. She put her hand on his lapel. He exhaled a single controlled breath and covered her hand with his. They stood like that for a moment, not kissing, not moving, just standing in the building that had brought them here with the city outside and the past preserved around them. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. February and March, she told Jonah. His response was a long, expressionless look, followed by, "I've already updated the conflict of interest disclosure in our project documentation," which was Jonah, for I knew 6 weeks ago, and I've been waiting for you to figure it out. She told her sister Bess, who reacted with considerably more enthusiasm and approximately 45 minutes of questions. She told no one else. The nature of the relationship was quiet and careful, which suited them both. They were not the kind of people who made public gestures. They had dinner twice a week or thereabouts. He came to her apartment in Chelsea, the top floor of a brownstone she'd renovated herself, which she'd been told was a form of therapy, and which she preferred to think of as applied expertise. She saw his apartment for the first time in March, a high floor place on the Upper East Side with a view that was stunning and a kitchen that had clearly never been used and bookshelves that told her more about him than anything he'd said in 4 months of knowing him. He had Fabri's daughter's phone number in his contacts. He'd called her. He hadn't told Maren that until she found the record in his phone one evening when she was looking for a restaurant number, and he had offered his phone because she couldn't find hers. "You called her," she said. "Last month. What did you say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told her the building was going to be preserved. I told her what we found on the 6th floor, that the ceiling and the lobby floor were designed by her father and that both were going to be restored." He paused. She cried. Maren put his phone down on the counter very carefully. "Did you go see her?" she asked. "Not yet." He held her gaze. "I thought we could go together." She looked at him across his spotless kitchen with the city glittering beyond the windows. This man who had planned to demolish a building and changed his mind, who had called a 93-year-old woman in Astoria to tell her her father's work would last. "Yes," she said. "Let's go together." They went in April. Carla Fabri DiMaggio was tiny and sharp-eyed and 93 years old, and she received them in the common room of her care facility in Astoria with the precise dignity of someone who had lived her whole life at a respectful angle to the world. Maren had brought photographs, the restoration progress. The ceiling in its cleaned and partially restored state, the lobby floor newly revealed under the protective covering that had been laid over it during construction. Carla looked at each one in turn, with a silence that was neither neutral nor sad, but something more complex than either. "He worked on that ceiling for 4 months, she said finally in a voice that was still strong. "He would come home with plaster dust in his hair. My mother tried everything to get it out." A pause. "I was 5. I thought it was snow." Maren felt Declan's hand find hers under the table and hold it. "When will it be finished?" Carla asked. "September," Maren said. "We'd like to invite you to the opening if you're willing to come." Carla looked at her, then at Declan, then at their joined hands. A small knowing expression moved across her face. "I'll come," she said. "My granddaughter can drive me. She's been wanting an excuse to see Manhattan." The Marcus Trent matter resolved itself in April, which was not a coincidence. Trent had been attempting the same leveraging tactic with 2 other projects in Manhattan, using relationships and proximity to push through development partnerships that were considerably more advantageous to him than to the original owners. One of those owners had been less scrupulous than Maren had taken the deal and was now in the middle of a dispute that was headed toward arbitration and potentially litigation. A Times piece ran in mid-April. Trent's methods were laid out in some detail. His name appeared in the same sentence as undue influence and misrepresentation of fiduciary relationships. None of his projects where the Hargrove and Maren's name didn't appear. But Sylvia Caldwell's name appeared once in a parenthetical, and Maren suspected Sylvia's professional reputation was going to have a very complicated spring. She read the piece at her drafting table on a Wednesday morning and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unmoored since February. She sent Declan the link with a single message, timing. He wrote back, gratifying. She smiled at her screen, the kind of smile she'd have been embarrassed by a few months earlier. She saved the smile for the drafting table where no one could see it and got back to work. Spring on the Hargrove project was the best kind of professional experience, the kind where everything you've designed in the abstract starts to become real and reality exceeds what you designed. The sixth-floor ceiling restoration was complete by late April. Marin stood in the space on the morning the scaffolding came down and looked up at Fabri's plasterwork, cleaned, repaired, gleaming in the spring light coming through the newly restored windows, and felt the specific satisfaction of work done the right way. The geometric pattern moved across the ceiling in the same rhythm as the lobby floor 30 feet below it, top and bottom of the same thought, the same mind working in plaster and stone across a 90-year distance. The ninth-floor cherry paneling had been cleaned and repaired and was now, in Marin's estimation, the most beautiful room in the building. She had designed the space as a private event room, the kind of space that could host a small dinner or a board meeting or a wedding reception because it felt wrong to subdivide it into offices or apartments. Some rooms deserved to remain rooms. She had not shown it to Declan yet. She was saving it. The residential units on the upper floors were taking shape. 32 apartments, each one designed with the building's original character in mind. High ceilings, original window configurations were structurally possible materials that spoke to the 1931 vocabulary without being slavishly historical. Polished concrete that echoed the terrazzo. Stone and dark wood. Warm metal hardware. The commercial spaces on the lower 3 floors were her particular design challenge and her particular pride. She had convinced Declan over 3 meetings and 2 detailed financial analyses to dedicate the ground floor corner space to a cultural tenant rather than retail. A gallery. A museum annex. Something that acknowledged the building's history in a publicly accessible way. It lowers the revenue per square foot on the ground level, he had said. I know. Significantly. I know. She'd held his gaze. It also makes the building meaningful in a way that no luxury retail tenant can replicate. And meaning drives value over time in a way that retail can't sustain. He had looked at her for a long moment, then, show me the comps. She'd shown him the comps. He'd approved the tenant structure. She had subsequently approached the New York Historical Society about a permanent installation focused on the building's architectural history and the immigrant craftsmen who had built Midtown Manhattan. They'd said yes within a week. The installation would open with the building. May. A crisis which was also not unexpected. No project of this scale went through without one. The HVAC replacement had uncovered in the upper mechanical floors evidence of asbestos encapsulation that the original survey had not fully scoped. The remediation was not optional and was not cheap. It extended the timeline by 6 weeks and added a material cost overrun that required a conversation Marin was not looking forward to. She called Declan on a Thursday morning and told him directly. No framing, no softening. How much? He said. She told him. A silence. She waited through it. What are the options? He said. 3. Full remediation, which is what I'm recommending. Partial remediation with operational restrictions on the affected floors, which is cheaper but limits our residential unit count. Or, and I'm obligated to present this option delay and reassessment which buys time but not money, and we end up in the same place. Full remediation, he said without hesitation. It'll push the opening to October. Then we open in October. She exhaled. I'll call the remediation contractor today. Marin. His voice had shifted lower, more private. The voice he used when they weren't talking about the project. Are you okay? I'm fine. It's a setback. Setbacks are part of... That's not what I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the Chelsea street was bright with May morning. A pigeon sat on the fire escape. The city did what the city does. I'll be better when it's fixed, she said. I know. A pause. I'll come by tonight. She felt the particular relief of someone who doesn't ask for help easily and has found a person who offers it anyway. Okay, she said. He came by that night with takeout from the Thai place on 9th Avenue that they'd discovered 3 months ago, and that had since become their default. They ate at her kitchen table. She had a kitchen table, which he did not. This was a point of mild ongoing commentary, and she talked through the remediation timeline and then eventually talked through other things. Her father. The building's original architect, a man named Bernard Holt, who had died in 1962 and whose grandson lived in Portland and had been, when Marin tracked him down, moved nearly to silence by what was happening to his grandfather's building. The way this project had become somewhere in the 18 months since that November sidewalk, a kind of inheritance. I think about my mother in that building, Declan said. It was late. They'd moved to the sofa the takeout containers long since dealt, with the city quiet outside in the way it gets around midnight in Chelsea. How much she loved it, how much she hated the idea of the version of me that made the choice I almost made. You changed your mind, Marin said, because you called me on it. He paused. I'm good at convincing myself that the practical argument and the right argument are the same thing. I was doing that with the Hargrove. He looked at her. You made me stop. She thought about that, about the sidewalk in November, about the cold and the work light in the city, and the choices people make about what to preserve and what to let go. The building made you stop, she said. I just gave it a voice. He shook his head slightly. No, you gave it my mother's voice. That's different. She looked at him. He was looking at her with complete steadiness, the way he looked at things he'd decided about. She leaned across the space between them and kissed him. It was the first time. Unhurried and deliberate, both of them too old and too careful for impulse. Both of them too honest to pretend that what they were doing was anything other than a choice made clearly and with full knowledge. He kissed her back. His hand came up to her jaw, careful, and she felt the care in it, the same care he'd given to the building, to the project, to every measured decision in the time she'd known him. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him. Okay, she said, the word they'd been trading since November. It had collected meaning in the months between. Yeah, he said. His hand was still at her jaw. Okay. Summer. The remediation resolved. The project came back online. The timeline held barely. October was tight, but possible, and the team was working with the kind of focus that comes when a finish line is visible. Marin was at the Hargrove most days now, which meant she was at the Hargrove with Declan most days, which they had arrived at a functional professional equilibrium about. Site meetings were site meetings. On the project, they were client and designer. Off the project, they were something else, something that didn't have a clean name because neither of them was particularly interested in naming things before they were ready to be named. Jonah observed all of this with the expression of a man who had learned long ago that Marin Cole did things in her own time and on her own terms, and that the appropriate response was patience and strategic silence. In July, the New York Historical Society installed the first elements of the ground floor exhibition. Marin had spent 2 months consulting on the design of the space, not just the physical design, but the curatorial approach. The exhibition was called Built by Hand, and it documented through archival photographs and original drawings and material samples the craftsmen who had built the great buildings of Midtown Manhattan in the first half of the 20th century. Aldo Fabri had a significant section. There were photographs of him on the job site, plaster dust in his hair, the young man who would die at 41, having made floors and ceilings that would outlast him by nearly a century. She stood in front of his photograph on the day of the install and thought about his daughter who was coming in September, who had stood in this lobby as an old woman not knowing it was about to be taken from her, who would come back and see her father's name on a wall. There you are, Declan's voice from the lobby entrance. She turned. He was in shirt sleeves. He'd stopped wearing his jacket to site visits sometime in April, which she'd tracked without meaning to as a marker of something. Looking at Fabri, she said. He came to stand beside her and looked at the photograph. I've been thinking, he said, about the 9th floor. She turned to look at him. I want to rename it, he said. The event space. I want to call it the Fabri Room. She stared at him. We have the DiMaggio name in the exhibition, he said. But the room itself is his work as much as any section of the floor or the ceiling. More maybe. It's the whole vocabulary. He paused. If you agree. She was aware that her face was doing something she couldn't entirely control. It's your building, she said. Her voice was slightly less steady than she wanted it to be. It's your room, he said simply. I wouldn't have done any of this without you, so I'm asking if you agree. She looked at him for a moment. Then, yes, the Fabri Room. He nodded, as if they had agreed on a material specification, as if he hadn't just handed her something she didn't quite have language for. She turned back to the photograph. He stood beside her. The building worked quietly around them, the sounds of tools from above, the particular aliveness of a structure being remade. It's going to be beautiful, he said. I know, she said. It already is. August. 2 months from the October opening. Marin was running on adrenaline and 2 years of work momentum, and the particular high of being close to the finish line. She had allowed herself to acknowledge sometime in late June in love with Declan Hargrove. Not the falling into love of younger years, that dizzy and imprecise feeling of losing her footing. This was more like arriving somewhere, like recognizing a place you've known about but never been. She had not said it. They had not said it. They were both, she suspected, the kind of person who held important things close until the moment was right, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of them. The moment would come. She trusted that. In August, a complication arrived that was not a construction setback and not a bad faith actor. It was a phone call from a journalist named Patrick Whelan, who wrote about real estate and development for a major business publication, and who had been following the Hargrove story since Marin's original Times piece. "I want to do a feature," he said. "The full story. The building, the preservation fight, the adaptive reuse model. What it took to pull this off." "It hasn't opened yet," she said. "I know. I want to get ahead of it." A pause. "Can I talk to both of you, you and Hargrove?" She said she'd discuss it with Declan. She discussed it with Declan that evening over takeout at her kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment. Both of us. He looked at his food. "He'll write about the relationship." "Probably." She held his gaze. "Does that bother you?" A pause. He was honest. He was always honest, which was one of the things she had come to most rely on. "No," he said. "Not if it's handled right." He looked at her. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the reflex answer, not the professional calculus, but the actual answer. "It means saying it's real," she said, out loud on record. "Is it real?" She looked at him across the kitchen table with the takeout containers between them and the city outside and the building a mile north waiting. "Yes," she said. "It's real." Something in his face, the controlled, precise face she'd been reading for nearly a year, went very still, then eased. "Then tell Whelan yes," he said. The Whelan piece ran in the issue before the October opening. It was long a cover story which neither of them had expected. It told the story from the beginning, the demolition notice, the Times op-ed, the first meeting, the structural assessment, the discovery of the ceiling and the paneling and Fabri's work, the full arc of the preservation and renovation project. It was precise and fair and very well reported. It called Marin one of the most significant preservation advocates to emerge in New York in the past decade, and called the Hargrove Project a model for how adaptive reuse can reimagine the relationship between historical significance and contemporary urban life. It also, in 2 paragraphs near the end, noted that the professional relationship between Marin Cole and Declan Hargrove had, over the course of the project, become something more. It handled this with discretion and without prurience. It simply said some collaborations done right become more than collaborations, and that sometimes the people who push each other hardest in a room end up being the people who understand each other best. Marin read it at her desk on a Wednesday morning. She read those 2 paragraphs twice. Then she called Declan. "You read it," he said when he picked up. "I read it. And he got it right," she said. A pause. Then quietly, "Yeah, he did." The October opening. She had been planning it for 8 months since February, since the first conversation about what the building should feel like to the people who would live and work in it. An opening was not just a party. An opening was the first impression the building made on the world in its new life. And first impressions, Marin believed with the conviction of long professional experience, were almost impossible to revise. She had spent considerable effort making sure this one was right. The event was held on a Thursday evening in mid-October, which was perfect. The light in New York. In mid-October has a quality that is particular to the city, and the season a richness that photographs as gold and feels in person like the city is briefly being generous with itself. The lobby was lit with a combination of the original sconces restored to working condition and subtle supplementary lighting that Marin had designed to bring out the terrazzo floor without washing it out. The effect she'd seen in the preview photos was exactly right. Carla Fabri. DiMaggio arrived at 6 o'clock with her granddaughter, a woman named Teresa, who was in her 50s and had the same sharp eyes as her grandmother. Marin met them at the entrance and walked Carla into the lobby and watched the old woman look at the floor her father had made. Carla didn't say anything for a long time. She stood in the center of the lobby and looked at the floor, and then up at the ceiling above the staircase, not the restored 6th-floor ceiling which she would see later, but the lobby ceiling with its original plasterwork intact. "He always said the floor and the ceiling should speak to each other," Carla said finally. Her voice was steady. "That a room should feel complete in both directions." "We found that," Marin said. "On the 6th floor. The ceiling and the floor are the same design. He did both." Carla looked at her. "I didn't know that. He died when I was 8. I didn't know as much as I should have." A pause. You knew more than I did about my own father's work. You gave me his name, Marin said. The rest was research. Carla reached out and took Marin's hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes, Marin saw, were not quite dry. Thank you, she said. Precisely. Without embellishment. The way you say thank you when you mean it completely. Declan gave a short speech near the beginning of the evening. He was not, she had learned, a natural public speaker. He spoke the way he did everything else, precisely and without flourish, which in a crowd was less warm than it was in person. But what he said was right. This building was built by people who believed in making things well, he said, standing near the center of the lobby. My family has owned it for nearly a century. We almost made a decision that would have erased all of that, the craft, the history, the people whose names were written into the floors and the ceilings and the walls. He paused. We didn't. And the reason we didn't is standing in this room tonight. He found Marin across the crowd. Buildings are made by people who care about them. This one got a second life because someone cared enough to fight for it. There was applause. She held his gaze across the lobby and felt the full distance from that November morning on the sidewalk, coffee, going cold crane overhead, the grip of impending loss to here, the building alive around them full of light, and people in history made present rather than lost. She raised her glass slightly. He raised his. The evening moved the way good evenings do in conversation and light, and the particular ease of a crowd that is genuinely celebrating something. The journalists were there, and the architects and the city council members, and the residents who had already moved into the upper floors. The New York Historical Society had staff on hand to walk people through the built-by-hand exhibition. The Fabry Room on the 9th floor was open for the first time, the cherry panels gleaming, and the steady stream of people who walked in and stopped talking was everything Marin had wanted. Bernard Holt's grandson had flown in from Portland. He was a slight, quiet man named Gerald, who had his grandfather's blueprints framed in his dining room, and who had, at their first conversation in the spring, told Marin that he thought buildings that lasted were a form of grace. He stood in the lobby for the better part of an hour, looking at things, and she left him to it. Late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the caterers were beginning their quiet operations, and the light in the lobby had gone from event warm to something softer and more particular, Declan came to stand beside her. They were near the east wall of the lobby, a few feet from a display case that held the original architectural drawings, Holt's 1929 blueprints found in the city archives, printed at full scale and mounted under glass. How does it feel? He asked. She looked at the lobby, at the terrazzo floor, at the sconces, at the people still moving through the space, still discovering it. Like I've been trying to build this room my whole life, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him beside her, his presence, which had become familiar in a way that surprised her, the way you can be surprised by something that has been true for a long time. I want to show you something, he said. Come upstairs. He led her up the staircase, the restored staircase with its original iron railing to the 9th floor. The Fabry Room was empty now. The last of the evening visitors had moved on. He pushed open the door and stepped in, and she followed. The room was lit from outside the October city through the west-facing windows, and within the cherry panels holding their warm glow. He had put candles on the table at the center of the room. She saw them now, simple white candles that had been burning long enough to be low and steady. A bottle of wine. 2 glasses. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded. No calculation in it, no management. I had something I wanted to say to you, he said. On the record, not in a building full of people. He paused. Here seemed right. She stood in the cherry-paneled room in the candlelight and looked at him. 8 months ago, he said. I was going to tear this building down. I had the permit. I had the crew. I had the financial justification. He paused. I had told myself that was the right decision because the numbers supported it, because the practical argument and the right argument were the same thing. Another pause. They weren't, and I knew they weren't. I just needed someone to tell me so. Declan, I'm not finished. His voice was gentle but direct. He always finished what he started. You told me so. And then you stayed. You fought for the building, and you showed me what it was, and you made it into something I couldn't have imagined. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, he stopped. He exhaled. He looked at her with the full steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is certain of it. Somewhere in the middle of all of that, I fell in love with you. The candles were very steady in the still air of the room. She looked at him. She thought about November, about the cold and the crane and the building's face. She thought about a lobby floor and a ceiling in conversation, about plaster dust and cherry wood and terrazzo, about a 93-year-old woman who had stood on her father's floor. She thought about 12 years of work, of making spaces that meant something, of carrying the conviction that beauty was not frivolous, that the past was worth fighting for, that some things deserved to be saved. She thought about standing in this room in January alone, sitting on the dusty floor, because she was too moved to stand. "I'll make it right," she had typed. She crossed the room. She put her hands on his lapels, both of them, this time deliberate, and looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I've been in love with you since January." His breath went out. His hands came to her waist. "January," he repeated. "The floor. You said your mother's studio was in this room." She held his gaze. "I sat on the floor for 10 minutes after." Something moved through his face, not quite surprise because he was not easily surprised, but something warmer than surprise. "You never told me that," he said. "I was trying to be professional." The corner of his mouth moved. "How'd that go?" Clearly not well. He kissed her in the Fabry room in the candlelight, with the cherry panels warm around them, and the city going on below, and the building that had been there since 1931, and would now be there for a century more, holding them both. Later they sat on the window ledge with the wine and looked out at the October city. The lights of Midtown spread below them. She could see the park dark and irregular, the river beyond. "My father proposed to my mother in the lobby," she said. He looked at her. "I know. You wrote it." "I was thinking about that tonight, when Carla came in." She paused. "I was thinking about it the first time I stood in this room, too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me about him." So she did. Her father, Martin Cole, who had been an architect, a quiet and passionate man, who had raised her on buildings and the stories of the people who made them, who had died 5 years ago, 2 weeks after her engagement ended, which had been the worst possible timing and also the only timing that had made the grief navigable because she'd had no choice but to hold both things at once. Who would have liked Declan, she thought? Who would have liked this? "He always said a building is a promise," she said, "that someone made to the people who would come after them. That when you preserve one, you're honoring the promise." "I think that's what my mother believed too," Declan said. "She just never put it in those words." They sat on the window ledge in the quiet of the room, with the city below them. "October is the right month to open it," he said. It always was. Outside New York was doing what it does in October, going gold and restless and magnificent, the city, in the brief and extraordinary key of autumn. Below them, the people who had come to see the building were filing out into the night, carrying the building with them, in the way that buildings stay with people, not in memory exactly, but in the body. In the sense of having stood somewhere that was made with care and intention and love and having felt it. The Hargrove building stood. It would keep standing. They sat in the candlelight and the last of the evening and let the city do what cities do. October became November. A year after the demolition notice, the Hargrove building had its first full residential occupancy, 32 households, a gallery, 3 commercial tenants, and the New York Historical Society's built-by-hand installation, which had been written about in 4 publications and had a wait list for its docent-led tours. Carla Fabry. DiMaggio's granddaughter Teresa called Marin in November to say that Carla had been telling everyone at the care facility about the building, that she had a photograph of herself in the Fabry room on her wall, that she had started telling the story of her father's work to anyone who would listen. She'd been quiet about it for years, Teresa said. She didn't think anyone cared about old buildings. A pause. "You made her think they did." Marin sat with that for a moment after she hung up. At her drafting table in the office that she and Jonah had built together with the 12 years of work on the walls and the $40 sofa in the corner, she pulled out her sketchbook, a habit from childhood sustained through all the years since, and turned to a new page. She started to draw. Not the Hargrove, not any current project, just the griffins from the entrance from memory, the ones she had drawn at 9 years old while her father held her hand and told her about the people who made beautiful things. She drew them from memory, and they came back to her perfectly. Declan took her to dinner in November. Not the Thai place in Chelsea or a working dinner after a late site meeting. A real dinner, the kind with a reservation, and a quiet table and candles, and everything arranged with the deliberateness of a man making a point. She wore the green dress she'd been saving since August without entirely knowing why. He wore the dark suit that fit him the way the made-for-his-body suits always did, And when he came to her door, he looked at her for a moment in the way that he did sometimes, with his full attention, unhurried, like she was a room he wanted to understand. "The green is right," he said. "I know," she said. Over dinner, they talked about the next project, a pre-war warehouse in Dumbo that had been flagged by a preservation group and had come to Marin's attention through the Landmarks Conservancy. She'd been looking at it with Jonah for 3 weeks. The bones were extraordinary. "Tell me," he said, and leaned in, and she told him about the warehouse, the way she told him about all the buildings, the history of it, the craft of it, the names she'd found attached to it, the story that was waiting inside the structure. He listened with full attention. He always did. After dinner, walking back through the November city, she had a coat on this time. The cold had arrived in earnest. He took her hand. They walked for a while. The city at night in November has a particular quality. The leaves gone, the light cold, the streets clear and direct in a way that summer softens and blurs. "I want to do the warehouse," he said. "If you're leading the design." She looked at him sideways. "That's a conflict of interest. It's a consistent track record," he said. "I'm a developer. I work with the best people I can find." He paused. "You're the best I've found." She looked ahead at the street. "That's professionally convenient. It's also personally true." He glanced at her. "I can live with the overlap." She thought about the year, about a November sidewalk and a cold cup of coffee, and a building she hadn't been able to walk away from. About fighting for something worth fighting for, and finding in the middle of the fight someone worth fighting alongside. "Okay," she said, the word they'd been using all year. "Let's do the warehouse." His hand tightened on hers. They walked on through the November city, the cold clear and the lights bright, and the buildings around them full of the stored warmth of the people inside them, promises made, and kept work done with love rooms built to last. Ahead of them, somewhere in the dark of Dumbo, a warehouse was waiting. She was already thinking about what it could become. But the year turned. January again. Exactly 1 year since Marin had sat on the floor of the 9th-floor room with the afternoon light falling through the newly uncovered windows and the cherry panels warm around her, and typed, "I'll make it," right into her phone. She had not marked the anniversary on her calendar. She found that she didn't need to. She was at her drafting table on the second Tuesday of January when her phone rang. An unknown number, not blocked. Just unknown. She picked up. "Ms. Cole." A woman's voice. Older and careful. "This is Teresa DiMaggio, Carla's granddaughter." Marin put her pen down. "Teresa, yes, how are you? How is Carla?" A pause. The kind of pause that tells you something before the words do. "My grandmother passed away 3 weeks ago," Teresa said. "Peacefully, at the facility." Another pause. "She asked me to call you. She wanted you to know." Teresa's voice was steady but carrying something. "She told me to tell you that she went with her father's picture on the wall, and she was very glad about the building. She said—" Teresa stopped. A breath. "She said her father's work was going to outlast everything, that it was the most important thing he'd ever done, and that someone finally knew his name." Marin sat very still at her drafting table. "She also wanted you to have something," Teresa said. "I could bring it to your office if that's all right, or I could mail it." "Please come," Marin said. "Whenever is convenient for you." Teresa came on a Thursday. She brought a small framed photograph original, not a reproduction aged to a warm sepia. Aldo Fabri, young, perhaps 25, standing on a scaffolding with his back to the camera, looking up at the ceiling of what was unmistakably the 6th floor of the Hargrove building. The plasterwork above him was in progress, half-formed. You could see the geometry emerging from the raw material. Marin held the photograph and looked at this man who had died at 41 without knowing his work would last. She hung it in her office, not on the wall with the project drawings, in a space of its own near her desk, where she could see it. February brought the first real design work on the Dumbo warehouse, the kind of work she loved most when everything was still possibility. She and Jonah and Declan had walked the building in January, the 3 of them in hard hats and work boots on the original pine plank floors, voices carrying in the empty industrial space. The roof was compromised and needed replacement. The loading dock doors on the east face were original and extraordinary. The cast iron structural columns were intact and perfect. "Mixed use," Marin had said in the echoing space of the main floor. Residential on the upper 2 levels, creative and studio tenants on 1 and 2, and the loading dock face activated for public use. She'd looked at the east-facing doors, the light through them going amber in the late afternoon. Those doors stay. We make a feature of them. Declan had looked at the doors and then at her and not said anything for a moment. Then, do the loading dock as the entrance to the public programming. Exactly, she said. Jonah had looked between them with the expression he made when he was deciding whether to comment on a dynamic he'd made a professional peace with. He decided not to comment. The Dumbo project was designated. The timeline was set. Cole plus Ward was engaged. Marin had already begun the historical research. The warehouse had been built in 1908. She'd found by a construction firm with an interesting history and a foreman whose name she was in the process of uncovering from city archives. She would find his name. She always found the names. Spring again. The city doing its impossible annual trick of returning to itself after the gray of winter. The Hargrove building had been open for 6 months. Marin walked past it on a Tuesday morning. She did this sometimes just to see it, to feel the specific pleasure of a thing done well, and found herself standing on the same sidewalk where she'd stood 14 months ago, with her coffee going cold and her heart doing something she hadn't let it do in years. She looked up at the building, the limestone pale in the morning light, the ornamental keystones above the third-floor windows, the bronze lobby doors refinished, catching the sun. She thought about her father, about the lobby floor and the promise someone makes to the people who come after them, about her father's proposal to her mother in that same lobby 40 years ago, about the loop of it, how things connect across time if you're willing to hold them together. A man in the lobby caught her eye and came to the doors. Declan. He was here early, which he often was. Now his office had migrated somehow from 6th Avenue to the Hargrove 2 days a week, which was professionally legitimate given that he owned the building, and which she had not pointed out was also about proximity. He opened the door and looked at her on the sidewalk with the morning light behind him. "I saw you from the lobby," he said. "I was just passing." "You always say that," she smiled. "I like to see how it looks from the outside." He came out onto the sidewalk and stood beside her, and they both looked up at the building together. The city moved around them. A cab, a delivery truck, someone walking a dog. The ordinary morning machinery of New York. "It looks good," he said. "It looks exactly right," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The building behind them and the city around them, and the particular quality of spring morning light in New York that makes everything look just slightly more possible than it did in winter. He reached into his jacket pocket. She felt rather than saw the movement and looked down. It was not a ring box. She registered this with the particular attention of someone who has been paying very precise attention to a person for a long time. It was a small, folded piece of paper. She looked at him. "Open it," he said. She unfolded it. It was a floor plan, the lobby of the Hargrove building drawn in Declan's handwriting, which she knew by now, precise architectural, in its own way, the lines clean. In the center of the lobby, he had drawn 2 small figures. Between them, in his careful hand, a single word. "Here." She looked up. He was watching her with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things he was certain about. No anxiety in his expression, no performance, just him present and decided. She thought about her father, who had proposed in this lobby, about the terrazzo floor and Fabri's name, about buildings as promises to the people who came after, about here, about now, about the year they'd spent making something beautiful together, and the lifetime of work and love and possibility that was she could see about to begin. "Yes," she said. "Here." He reached into his other pocket. The ring box was there after all he'd been waiting. She understood for her to have the paper first. It was exactly the kind of thing he would do. The ring was simple, platinum, a center stone that was some complicated color between gray and green like his eyes. And she would find out later that he had spent 3 weeks selecting the stone specifically for that reason, which was so like him, and so unlike the version of him she'd first imagined across a conference table that she felt the full distance of the year they'd traveled. He slid it on her finger on the sidewalk in front of the building her father had loved and she had saved. She held his face in her hands and kissed him there in the April morning in full view of the city. Behind them, through the bronze lobby doors, Fabri's floor caught the light. The building held. In September of the following year, at a small dinner held in the Fabry room on the 9th floor of the Hargrove building, Marin Cole and Declan Hargrove were married. The cherry panels were warm in the candlelight. The flowers were simple. There were 40 people in the room, which was exactly right. intimate, full, nothing wasted. Jonah Ward gave a speech that managed against all odds to be both precise and moving. The Dumbo warehouse opened 8 months later to considerable attention. The foreman's name was Otto Breckenridge, a German immigrant who had come to New York in 1896 and who had a great-granddaughter in New Jersey who cried when Marin called her. The Hargrove building is still there. It will be there for a long time. At the center of its lobby, on an inlaid terrazzo floor designed by a young man who died at 41 and loved his work, people cross back and forth on their way to ordinary days. Sometimes they look down. Sometimes they look up at the ceiling above the staircase and feel the geometry of it, the way the two spaces answer each other, top and bottom. Most of them don't know the name Aldo Fabri. Some do now. That's how it starts. The 6 weeks between the first meeting and the signed contracts were Marin would later think when she first started to understand who Declan Hargrove actually was. She'd done the research before their meeting, the professional history, the Caldwell Group's portfolio, the industry reputation. What the research gave her was accurate but incomplete the way a photograph is accurate and incomplete. The man who showed up in documents was brilliant, driven, exacting, difficult. Respected, but not universally liked. Known for holding positions with unusual firmness, and for being correct often enough that the firmness was tolerated. What the research didn't give her was the specifics of how his mind worked, how he approached a problem, the particular way he went quiet when he was genuinely thinking as opposed to the managed silence of someone buying time. The fact that he would, in the middle of a conversation about contract terms, ask a question that had nothing to do with contract terms and everything to do with what she actually believed about preservation, about architecture, about what buildings were for. He asked her once in one of their early phone calls whether she thought there was a difference between preserving a building because it was historically significant and preserving it because it was beautiful, whether those were the same motivation or different ones. She had not expected the question. She paused and thought about it seriously. They can be the same, she said, but they usually aren't. Historical significance is a category. Beauty is a response. You can be moved by a building's history in your mind without being moved by the building in your body. She paused again. The ones worth fighting for are the ones that do both. The Hargrove does both, he said. Yes. For you personally or in general. Both, she said. My father brought me to that building every time we walked past it. He made me look at the griffins until I could draw them from memory. That's personal. But the lobby floor, I didn't know about that when I was 9. I didn't find that until I started researching the building for my 2019 survey. That's objective. That's anyone. He was quiet for a moment. My mother loved the lobby floor. Did she know about Fabri? She knew the name. She didn't know much else. I found a 1954 article in the New York Daily News, Marin said. 3 paragraphs. It mentions the lobby floor in the context of a piece about the building's renovation at the time. It names the material but not the craftsman. She paused. The craftsman is always the last thing anyone names. That's what your article was really about, he said. Not a question. Not just the architectural significance. Yes. She paused. You read it that way. I read it several times, he said simply. She had felt something shift in her understanding of him with that admission. The directness of it. No pretense that he'd glanced at her work and formed an impression. He'd read it several times, so he'd said so. She had started to look forward to the calls. The structural assessment phase. Those 11 days had its own texture that she remembered precisely because she'd been trying not to pay attention to it and had paid attention to it anyway. The 2 engineers had met twice on site. She and Declan had not been required to attend those meetings. Both parties had their representatives, and the independent assessor was technically neutral. But they had both ended up at the building on the same morning, which was the 3rd day of the assessment, which she had told herself was coincidence, and which she was aware was not. They'd met at the entrance at 9 in the morning. He was carrying 2 coffees. He handed her one without comment as if he'd known she'd be there, and she took it without comment, and they'd gone in together. The thing about the Hargrove building under assessment was that it was partially exposed in a way it hadn't been in living memory. The engineers had opened up sections of wall and floor to examine structural elements, and what was revealed was the interior skeleton of a 1931 skyscraper, the steel and stone and concrete of it, the bare bones of a building that had been clothed in finishes for nearly a century. She found it startling and beautiful in a way she hadn't expected. The structure itself, the way the building had been built. Declan had stopped in front of one of the opened wall sections on the 3rd floor, a 2-foot-wide opening into the building's interior, the steel column visible, the original brick fire protection still in place, the strata of renovation work from different decades visible in cross-section. My great-grandfather used to talk about the construction, he said. He was looking at the wall section with the expression she was coming to recognize as thinking rather than managing. He said the iron workers sang. He thought that was remarkable that men working that high above the city could find the particular ease for singing. She looked at the exposed column. They weren't afraid of the height. He said they sang about being afraid of the height, Declan said, that the singing was the way they held it. A pause. He told that story every Thanksgiving. I thought he'd invented it. He probably hadn't, she said. There's documentation of that. The ironworkers on pre-war Midtown construction, particularly the Mohawk ironworkers who worked on most of the major buildings singing, was recorded by multiple observers. She paused. It's in a 1935 ethnographic study I found when I was writing the 2019 survey. He looked at her sideways. She felt the look but kept her eyes on the wall section. You really do research everything, he said. It's how I make the case, she said. You can't advocate for something you haven't learned completely. No, he said. You can't. A pause. I was going to demolish a building that men sang on the way up. His voice was flat, but not without something in it. Past tense, she said. Past tense, he agreed. They stood in the open third floor of the Hargrove building for a moment longer. Outside, the city did what it always does, indifferent and enormous, full of its own momentum. Inside the building's bones were visible in the November light, and she found herself thinking about the men who had put them there, about the ironworkers, about whether anyone knew their names. She was already planning the next phase of research. She had not mentioned to anyone outside the project, not to Jonah, not to Bess, not to the journalists who called for quotes, the specific texture of the project's early weeks. The particular quality of those conversations. The way a phone call that was scheduled for 15 minutes about contract scope had a recurring tendency to extend to 45 minutes and to arrive by the end at something that was not contract scope. She was careful professionally. She was careful because she had been here before or close enough to hear, and she knew what happened when you let professional care slide in favor of personal interest. The brief engagement in her late 20s, a landscape architect, a good man, someone she'd liked and admired, and been genuinely fond of, had foundered in part because the professional and personal had blurred in ways neither of them had managed well. She had decided then with the clarity of someone who has just navigated a specific kind of damage to keep the line clear. The line with Declan was present. She was keeping it, but she was also aware in the evenings after long calls that she was keeping it through something that required more effort than it should. This told her something. She recorded it with the same care she'd have given an observation about a building and set it aside. The third week of December. 2 weeks after the contracts were signed and the project was formally underway, she had a meeting she hadn't expected. It was with her father's oldest friend, a man named Raymond Okafor, who was a retired professor of architectural history at Columbia, and who had been her father's colleague for 30 years, and had been in the year after her father's death a quiet and reliable presence in her life. They had lunch occasionally. He sent her articles he thought she'd find useful. He had attended the preview of her 2019 survey with the pride of a man who considered her his professional progeny. Raymond, over lunch at a restaurant he liked on Amsterdam Avenue, had read the Whelan piece in the Times, not the eventual February feature, which was still months away, but her original op-ed, and wanted to talk about it. Your father would have been furious that it was almost demolished, Raymond said, and then very pleased that it wasn't. I know, she said. He talked about that building every time he walked past it, every time for 40 years. Raymond paused. He told me once that proposing to your mother in that lobby was the best design moment of his life. He'd thought about where to do it for 3 months. He paused again. He said the floor was right, that the floor made it feel like the ground itself was saying yes. Marin held her coffee cup and felt the particular quality of love for someone who is gone. The way it doesn't diminish, it just changes shape, takes up a different kind of space. I didn't know he'd thought about it that much, she said. He thought about everything that much, Raymond said. That's where you get it from. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that meant more than it showed. There's a man, Raymond said, in the tone of someone moving to a subject with deliberate casualness. The developer, Hargrove. She looked at him. Raymond? I'm just noting, he said. The piece is very precise about the architectural and historical arguments, but between the lines there's something. He set down his fork. You write about things you care about differently than things you're merely making a case for. You know that. It's his family's building, she said. The situation is emotionally complex. Yes, Raymond said, I'm sure it is. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has spent 60 years paying attention to things and has arrived at a comfortable indifference to pretense. She looked back at him. He reads architecture, she said finally. Not just as a businessman with buildings in his portfolio. He actually reads it. Raymond nodded slowly. Your father read everything too, he said. Your mother used to say she'd found him at 2 a.m. with a book on Byzantine construction methods that he'd ordered without mentioning it. Maren looked out the window at Amsterdam Avenue. It's early, she said. Of course it is, Raymond agreed. I'm just noting that you're thinking about it. He picked his fork back up. Your father would have been happy, I think, if it came to that. He always hoped you'd find someone who loved buildings the way you do. She ate her salad and thought about her father and the lobby floor and the particular meaning of the ground itself saying yes. She did not say anything else to Raymond about it. She didn't need to. The period between the signed contracts and the February complication was in its own way the most professionally charged of her career. Not because the work was harder than work she'd done before, it was complex, certainly, but she had the experience for it. It was charged because she was doing it with full knowledge of what she was not yet saying, and that knowledge was present in every conversation, every site, visit, every late call about HVAC infrastructure and stone restoration methodology, and the correct approach to window replacement in a landmark-adjacent structure. She had found in 12 years that the best working relationships were the ones built on a particular kind of intellectual honesty, where both parties could disagree clearly, where clarity was more valued than comfort, where the work could be argued about in the specific rather than the general. This working relationship had that, fully. She and Declan argued about things regularly and productively. She had changed his mind twice in the first month once, about the approach to the upper floor window replacement, where she'd convinced him that period-accurate wood frames were the right choice, even at higher cost. Once about the lobby furniture, where he'd initially wanted to commission contemporary pieces, and she'd made the case with reference to the Fabry floor for sourcing pieces from the original period. He had changed her mind twice in the same period about the structural approach to the foundation remediation, where his financial analysis of two competing methods had been genuinely better than her instinct, and about the timeline for the residential units where his construction management experience had suggested a sequencing she hadn't considered. She respected him for the first set of changes. She liked him for the second. There was a difference. The weeks before February, the complication the Sylvia lunch had also contained a moment she'd carried with her quietly. She'd been at the building late a Thursday in January, doing the final documentation on the cherry panels before the cleaning specialist began his work. The building was empty except for her. She had a work light and her camera and the particular focused quiet of someone doing precise work. She'd been photographing the panels section by section, floor to ceiling, left to right, when her phone rang. Declan. Are you still at the building? He said. How did you know I was at the building? You said you were going after the site meeting. It's been 3 hours. She looked at her camera, at the walls. The panels, she said. I want complete documentation before the cleaning starts. A pause. Have you eaten? She thought about this. She had had a sandwich around noon. Not since lunch. He had brought dinner. He'd picked up food from a place on 9th Avenue and come to the building with a paper bag and a thermos of coffee that he'd made at his apartment, which was the kind of detail that she had noted and not analyzed at the time, and had analyzed many times subsequently. They'd eaten on the floor of the 9th floor room. There was no furniture yet, and neither of them had suggested going somewhere else. They'd sat on the dusty floor with their backs against the cherry paneling and eaten and talked about the panels and then about other things. Her father. The way certain materials age, whether the cleaning specialist from Florence was as good as his reputation suggested. She'd asked him once, sitting on that floor in the work light warmth, what he would have done with the building if she hadn't called him back. He had been quiet for a moment. I've thought about that, he said. I think I would have proceeded with the demolition, and I think it would have been one of the decisions I couldn't revise or forget. He paused. I've made those. Most people have. But this one would have had particular weight. Because of your mother, she said. Because of her, yes. And because I knew before your article that it was a significant building. I just convinced myself that the knowing didn't require me to do anything. He looked at her sideways in the half-dark. You made that position harder to hold. Good, she said. He had looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the walls, and they had sat in the quiet of the building for a while longer before she said she needed to get home, and he had walked her to the corner and put her in a cab, and she had gone home and sat on her couch in the dark for 10 minutes before making herself do anything else. She had been in love with him by January. She'd been certain of it on the floor of the 9th-floor room, sitting against the cherry paneling with the work light warm and the city outside and the clean scent of old wood in the cold air. She'd sat with the certainty for months before she'd let herself do anything with it. That was right. It was the right thing to do. But she had known. There is a specific quality to professional satisfaction that Marin had always believed was undersold, the particular kind of pleasure that comes not just from making something beautiful, but from making something meaningful, from adding to, rather than subtracting from the built record of human life. She had chosen this work at 9 years old in front of a building that had moved her, and she had never meaningfully questioned the choice. She was aware of this as a form of fortune which not everyone was given, and which she did not take lightly. What she had not expected, had not in her more honest moments allowed herself to expect, was the doubling of that fortune. The discovery that the work itself could generate the life. That in fighting for a building you could find a person. That some of the structures worth preserving were not made of limestone and terrazzo, but of years and trust, and the slow accumulation of being known. She thought about this in the evening sometimes. In the apartment, she'd made herself on the sofa she'd bought for its bones. The particular luck of it. The way the year had opened and changed. She thought about her father, who had loved a building and proposed in it, and raised a daughter who loved it in her turn. About how care for something compounds across generations. How a craftsman's name recovered brings his daughter's picture to a wall. How the ground says yes. She thought about Declan, who had been going to take something apart, and had been persuaded not to, and who had turned out to be the kind of person who once persuaded went all the way, who found Carla's number and called it, who named a room, who drew a lobby floor on a folded piece of paper and asked. Here, she thought about her own life, which was full of work she loved and a man she loved, and a city that was impossible and magnificent, and hers, which was full of buildings that were still standing, that had been made with care, and would outlast all of them, carrying the names of the people who had shaped them into a future that hadn't been born yet. That was enough. That was, she thought, entirely enough. Outside New York was doing what it always did. Enormous and indifferent and alive. The building held. There was a version of the story that Marin understood she'd been telling herself long before she knew it was a story. It started with a city, specifically with the version of New York City that exists for the people who pay attention to its bones, who walk down a block and notice what the facade tells you about when a building went up and what money looked like in that decade, and whose aesthetic was ascendant, and who built it and for whom. This is not a common way to walk through a city. Most people see streets and buildings the way they see weather, as context, the frame around the thing rather than the thing itself. Marin had never been able to do that. Buildings were the thing. Her mother used to joke that Marin had been born with architectural criticism in her blood, and a grievance against every developer who'd ever slapped glass curtain wall on a pre-war building. This was not precisely accurate, but was not precisely wrong. Her mother was also the one who had told Marin after the engagement failed that the right man would be someone who understood what she was doing when she stood on a sidewalk looking up at a building. Not intellectually, not in an effort to engage her world. Someone who did it naturally, who looked up without being told. Declan, she had noticed on that third morning of the structural assessment, looked up. He hadn't been examining anything. He'd been standing in the lobby waiting for the engineers and looking up at the lobby ceiling. The original plasterwork, the geometric borders, the central medallion above the old elevator doors, and he had the expression of someone who was doing it for its own sake. Not professionally, not strategically, because the ceiling was there and it was worth looking at. She had filed that observation with the same precision she filed construction data. Cole Plus Ward had grown steadily since its founding in the brownstone on West 22nd Street. 8 full-time staff, now 2 associates who had been with her for 6 years, a junior designer fresh from architecture school who was so talented it was slightly alarming. They had a reputation in the industry for work that was exact and historically informed and aesthetically distinctive, the combination that produces in architectural circles, a specific kind of respect that is harder to generate than fame and more durable. She had built the firm with Jonah over 12 years. They were not alike. He was methodical, where she was visionary patient, where she was urgent given to caution, where she moved on instinct, and the firm was better for it. They had a shorthand built over a decade of making things together. They trusted each other's professional judgment completely, which was rare and was she knew not something you could design. It either emerged from years of work or it didn't. She had thought when the Hargrove project began about what it meant to bring such a large and personally significant commission into a firm the size of Cole plus Ward. The project was larger than anything they'd attempted. The budget was larger. The stakes, personal, professional, historical, were layered in ways she'd had to consciously separate in order to think clearly about any one of them. What she had not anticipated was that the project would be the moment the firm came into its full capability, that the scale of it, the complexity of it, the demands of it would reveal what Cole plus Ward could do when given room to do it completely. By the time the Whelan piece ran in October, the firm had received calls from 3 developers and 2 preservation organizations. The Hargrove project had put them, as Jonah said, with the precision he gave to all his assessments on a different level. She was grateful for this. She was also aware that it was a consequence rather than the thing itself. The thing itself was the building. The thing itself was always the building. In the weeks after the opening, Marin received several invitations to speak at a conference on adaptive reuse, to join an advisory board for a preservation organization, to participate in a design jury at an architecture school. She accepted 2 and declined 1, applying the criterion she'd always applied. Does this generate value in the direction that matters, or is it the performance of value which is different? The conference on adaptive reuse she said yes to. She had something to say. She spoke for 40 minutes to an audience of architects and developers and preservation advocates in a conference center in Midtown, and she said what she actually thought, which was the question of whether to preserve a building is almost never a purely financial question, and the error most developers make is treating it as one. The financial case for adaptive reuse is real, but it is not always immediately visible, and making it visible requires the kind of long historical thinking that does not come naturally to most financial models. You have to look further out. You have to understand that a building with a story compounds value across time in a way that a building without one cannot. She also said the craftsmen matter. The names matter. The record of who made what and when and how is part of the building's structural integrity as surely as it's steel and stone. When you lose the names, you lose something that cannot be reconstructed because you cannot reconstruct the particular pride of a craftsman's family in knowing that their ancestors' work endures. She talked about Fabry for several minutes. She talked about the ceiling and the floor in conversation. She talked about Carla in the lobby with her father's picture on her wall. She did not talk about Declan. That was private, but she could feel in what she said about the preservation fight and the conversion and the decision to hold rather than demolish the shape of the year they'd shared. Its weight, its meaning. Afterward, a developer from Chicago came up and told her she'd changed his thinking. He said it simply without charm, the way someone says something they mean. She thanked him. She meant it too. Declan was at the conference. She hadn't invited him, and he hadn't told her he was coming. He was on the panel in the afternoon on a separate session about financing structures for adaptive reuse, which she'd known about, but hadn't connected to her own appearance. She saw him from the stage in the first 5 minutes in the 4th row already watching her. She held his gaze for 1 beat. Then she looked at her notes and began. They met for coffee in the hotel lobby afterward, in the way of 2 people who have arrived at a relationship where logistics are managed without ceremony. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the specific form of his approval. Not praise, not performance. Just the look of someone who has seen something good. You changed someone's mind, he said. The Chicago developer. I heard the conversation. He paused. You do it the same way you do everything. Completely. She looked at him. You're going to be annoying about this all day. I'm going to be precise about it, he said. There's a difference. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes when someone you love says something exactly like themselves. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The ring caught the hotel light. You ready? He said. She meant the next session, the afternoon, the practical logistics of the rest of the day. She also meant the rest of it. The next project, the next building, the next name they would find and return to whoever it belonged to. The life that was in the morning of a November that had become spring, that had become a year fully and completely underway. Yes, she said. Let's go. They went. Expanded the first winter and what it cost her. The first winter of the project that stretched from November through January, that felt both very long and very short in memory, had its own set of private costs that Marin didn't discuss with anyone. She had a rule about personal and professional, and she was keeping it. And keeping it required a specific kind of daily effort that she noted the way she noted other forms of expenditure precisely and without drama. She was the kind of person who had always paid attention to what things cost. Not financially. Money was a tool like any other, and she had enough of it to do the work she wanted to do. She meant attention, energy, the particular kind of clarity that is required when you are doing something that matters, and you cannot afford to be clouded. The cloudedness that winter was intermittent and manageable and persistent. She managed it the way she managed everything through work. She arrived at the Hargrove before the crew most mornings. She stayed late. She pulled the historical research in directions she hadn't planned, finding names and stories and connections she hadn't initially looked for, because the depth of it was its own answer to the other thing. If she understood the building completely, if she knew every name and every story and every material choice and every creative decision that had gone into its construction, then there was no room for anything else. This worked. It worked until it stopped working, which was usually around 9 or 10 in the evening, alone in her apartment on West 22nd Street, when the building was not present and the work was done and there was nothing to be precise about. She was not someone who kept diaries, but she had a notebook, a plain black moleskin that she used for project notes and quick sketches, and the occasional observation she needed to put somewhere outside her head. In December of that first winter, she filled 6 pages of that notebook with observations about the Hargrove building that were not precisely about the building. She did not reread those pages. She knew what they said. The specific day she had decided to call him back after the voicemail, after the blocked number, she had stood in her office for 5 minutes with her phone in her hand before she pressed the button. She had been thinking about what she was walking into. A fight, probably. A difficult client. Certainly no one who called their own client relationship a professional asset and then arranged a meeting was going to be easy to work with. The personal history of the building, his family's ownership, the complexity of what demolition meant in that context, all of it was going to make the conversation harder than a straightforward preservation dispute. She admitted to herself in those 5 minutes, been thinking about the particular quality of the voicemail. The voice. The specific flatness of someone who had learned to keep the affect dialed down, and the intelligence that was present anyway in the precision of the phrasing. I read your piece in the Times. Not, I saw your piece, he had read it. The distinction mattered. She pressed the button. 12 seconds later, he answered. Ms. Cole? She still remembered the quality of his voice on that first call, how it was the same as the voicemail, and different. Less managed, more present. She had made herself professional and direct, and not thought about any of this for several months. Then she had thought about it in the cherry-paneled room in January, sitting on the dusty floor, and had understood that the not thinking had been a temporary measure rather than a resolution. She was good at temporary measures. She was less good at the moment they ran out. Jonah, who had known her for 11 years, had figured it out the week after the January floor-sitting incident. She had not told him about the incident. He had arrived at the conclusion through other means, which was characteristic. He had come to her doorway on a Tuesday morning, the specific Tuesday she remembered, because she'd been working on the lobby lighting plan and had been finding it harder to concentrate than usual, and had said, I'm going to update our conflict of interest policy. She had looked up. We have a conflict of interest policy. I'm updating it. He paused, prospectively. She had looked at him for a long moment. He had looked back at her with the expression he made when he was going to be honest rather than comfortable. It's a client relationship, she said. Right now it is, he said. I'm updating the policy prospectively. She had held his gaze for another beat. Then, thank you, Jonah. Don't thank me, he said. Just tell me before it's in the Times. She had found out 8 months later that he had indeed already updated the policy before that conversation, that he'd done it in December, a full month before she'd had her realization on the floor. He had updated the policy and said nothing about it to her because he was Jonah, and he was 12 years of good judgment, and because he trusted her to arrive at her own conclusions in her own time. She had thanked him for that too. He had told her to stop thanking him and get back to the Dumbo warehouse plans. She had. The plans were good. The last thing she wanted to say about the first winter, about the effort of keeping the line clear, and the work that cost, and what she'd been carrying in the quiet of the evenings, was this. It had been worth it. Entirely and specifically worth it. Not just because the outcome had been good, but because the keeping of it had been right. Had been a form of respect for the project, for him, for herself. She had learned a long time ago that love that starts clearly is better than love that starts clouded, that the waiting to be certain was not delay, but foundation. She had been certain on the dusty floor in January. She had waited 9 months for the moment to be right. She thought the building that had held all of it, that had been the space in which two people had found each other in the process of finding it, would have approved of that. Buildings, her father had said, were patient. They had been standing before you got there and would be standing after. The least you could do was be worth their patience. She thought she had been. She thought they both had. The building held. The city went on. The work continued. And somewhere in the particular quality of a spring morning in Manhattan, the light gold and the air clear, and the buildings casting their long, familiar shadows on the streets below, a woman in a charcoal blazer looked up at a pale limestone facade and felt fully and without reservation that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She went inside. The terrazzo floor caught the light. The ground said yes. 2 years after the demolition notice, the Hargrove building had a waiting list for its residential units. The Built by Hand exhibition had been extended twice. The Fabry Room had hosted 47 events, including 6 weddings, one of which had been Marin's own. Bernard Holt's grandson Gerald had come back from Portland twice more. On the second visit, he had brought his daughter, 12 years old, the same age Marin had been when her father first pointed out the Griffins, and Marin had watched the girl look up at the entrance and had felt the particular continuity of it. The shape of what passes from one set of hands to the next. Otto Breckenridge's great-granddaughter in New Jersey had been to the Dumbo warehouse opening. She'd brought 3 cousins. They'd stood in the loading dock entrance with the cast-iron columns rising around them and the city visible through the east-facing doors, and Marin had made sure someone told them the story. Teresa DiMaggio had sent a card in October on the anniversary of the opening. Simple handwriting. She would have loved this year. Thank you for all of it. Thank you for... Marin kept the card in the same drawer as the notebook from the first winter. She didn't need to reread either of them. She knew what they said. She had, in the 2 years since that November sidewalk, become the kind of architect she had always known she was capable of being. Not famous exactly. The right publications, the right projects, the right reputation in the industry, but fully realized. Doing the work the way the work deserved to be done. She was also in those same 2 years the kind of person she had always hoped she could become, which is a different achievement and a harder one, and was not something she could take full credit for. That one had taken 2 people. And a building. Always the building. She was sitting at her drafting table on a Thursday morning in late November, 2 years, almost to the day from the demolition notice, when Declan came through the office door. This was not unusual. He came to the office sometimes. Jonah had long since arrived at a functional and unacknowledged equilibrium with this, but he was carrying coffee, which she registered, and he had an expression she'd learned to read over the past 2 years as him carrying something. "What is it?" she said. He set the coffee down on her desk. "There's a building in Philadelphia." She looked at him. 1929, he said. Art Deco, original facade intact. Owner is thinking about a sale, and the prospective buyer is a developer who'll put up glass, she said. "Condos," he confirmed. She picked up the coffee. "Is there documentation?" "I had my researcher pull what's available." He set a folder on her desk. "The craftwork on the facade is significant. Terracotta. Not Chicago school, but informed by it." She opened the folder, looked at the photographs. She looked up at him. "You want to go to Philadelphia," she said. "I want to show it to you and see what you think." He paused. "And then, depending on what you think, I want to make an offer." She looked at the photographs again. The facade. The terracotta. The particular quality of a building that had been standing for nearly a century and had more to give. She thought about Philadelphia. About how the work expanded outward always if you let it. About how the names were everywhere waiting to be recovered. About how much there was still to do. "When," she said. "Saturday, if you can." She looked at her calendar. "I can." "Good." He picked up the folder and tucked it under his arm. He bent and kissed her on the top of her head, which was domestic and direct and entirely like him, and straightened. "I'll drive." He walked out of the office. She heard him exchange a word with Jonah in the hall, something brief, the particular shorthand of two men who had arrived at mutual respect through proximity and time. She looked at her drafting table, at the current project, at the photographs of the Philadelphia building still open in front of her. She thought about her father, about the Griffins, about a 9-year-old girl drawing from memory on a sidewalk. She picked up her pencil and started sketching. Outside New York was doing what it always does. The work went on,